Have you ever felt your soul shrink upon entering a place so noisy you can barely hear your own thoughts? Have you noticed that frequently, those who talk the most have the least to say? We live submerged in an ocean of noise. Our cities vibrate with the incessant roar of traffic, sirens wailing in the distance, fragmented conversations filtering through from strangers' phones, music escaping from headphones at full volume, construction work hammering our eardrums from dawn. This is just the beginning. Our digital spaces are equally saturated with notifications, messages, auto-playing videos, and the constant buzz of opinions nobody requested but everyone offers. The acoustic chaos of modern life isn't accidental. It perfectly reflects our inner confusion. We've become beings who fear silence because silence forces us to confront ourselves. To face those uncomfortable truths we prefer to drown with more and more noise. Dostoevsky understood this deeply when creating characters like Alyosha Karamazov or Elder Zosima. These fictional but profoundly human beings cultivated a silent presence that emanated not from timidity or insecurity, but from unshakable inner strength. Silence, for them, wasn't emptiness, but fullness. Not absence, but the purest form of presence. This conscious silence we find in the great Russian writer's literature reminds us of something our contemporary society seems to have forgotten. True power doesn't need to constantly proclaim itself. Real wisdom rarely announces itself with trumpets and drums. Consider how our brain processes the chaotic symphony of stimuli bombarding it daily. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Dostoevsky intuited more than a century ago. Our attention capacity is a limited and precious resource. Each interruption, each unnecessary noise, each empty conversation represents a small theft of our mental clarity. And these small thefts, accumulated day after day, leave us mentally exhausted, emotionally drained, and spiritually empty. The mental confusion caused by acoustic pollution isn't a simple passing annoyance. It's a toxic fog that settles in our thinking, clouding our ability to discern the essential from the trivial, the true from the false, the beautiful from the merely striking. In major cities, noise has been normalized to become part of the landscape. Street vendors announce their products with megaphones. Buses compete for passengers with blaring music. Conversations rise above the ambient noise, creating layers upon layers of cacophony. And we, inhabitants of this chaotic soundscape, have developed a dangerous tolerance for noise, like someone who becomes accustomed to breathing polluted air until forgetting how it feels to fill their lungs with clean air. But there is another path, the deliberate cultivation of silence as a form of personal elegance. This elegance doesn't consist of withdrawing from the world or avoiding communication. Quite the opposite. It consists of speaking only when we have something valuable to contribute. It consists of creating spaces of tranquility that allow our thoughts to crystallize before being expressed. It consists of developing the almost forgotten art of deep listening. At a family dinner, who shows greater dignity? The uncle who monopolizes the conversation with his opinions on everything, interrupting at every moment, or that aunt who observes attentively, listens patiently, and, when she finally speaks, offers a perspective that transforms everyone's understanding. In a work meeting, who demonstrates true leadership? The executive who fills every silence with words to demonstrate his supposed competence, or the one who allows others to express themselves and only intervenes to synthesize, clarify, or contribute a vision that positively reorients the discussion. The dignity of those who remain silent doesn't come from an inability to speak, but from self-control and awareness that words, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. Like an arrow released, each word has the power to heal or to hurt, to build or to destroy. Silence, when consciously chosen rather than imposed by fear or insecurity, becomes a sacred space where our thinking can expand without the constant pressure to formulate immediate responses. In that space, truly original ideas, creative solutions, and deep understandings are born that would never emerge in the mental chaos caused by endless exposure to noise. The practice of intentional silence also allows us to develop a presence that doesn't need to constantly announce itself to be perceived. It's that magnetic quality possessed by certain people who, without raising their voice, manage to make everyone in the room pay attention when they decide to speak. This type of silent presence also protects us from one of the most common evils of our time: compulsive reactivity. How many friendships have broken over words spoken in the heat of the moment? How many opportunities have been lost due to hasty responses? How much regret is born from not having kept silent when it was the wisest course? Silence is also an act of respect toward others. When we decide not to fill every moment with the noise of our words, we're creating space for others to express themselves. We're recognizing that we aren't the only ones with something valuable to contribute. Developing this silent dignity requires practice and patience, especially in a world that seems to reward constant, noisy expression over quiet reflection. Begin by creating small moments of silence in your day. 5 minutes in the morning, before the world fully awakens. 10 minutes at sunset to process the day's events. Brief moments during the workday where you simply breathe and observe without the need to produce, consume, or react. Gradually, these moments of external silence facilitate the development of internal silence, that capacity to maintain mental calm even amid urban chaos. It's possible to walk through downtown Manhattan at rush hour and maintain a center of inner stillness that protects us from the mental confusion that noise tries to impose on us. The elegance of silence is, ultimately, a form of freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of external noise. Freedom from the compulsion to immediately respond to every stimulus. Freedom to consciously choose what deserves our voice and what deserves our silence. And this freedom, this mastery over our words and our reactions, is perhaps the highest form of human dignity we can cultivate in times where noise isn't just a nuisance, but a deliberate strategy to keep us distracted, confused, and alienated from our deepest essence. Noise as vulgarity disguised as presence. Noise has become the counterfeit currency of our era. Imitating the shine of authentic gold, constant din pretends to pass for presence, relevance, vitality, but it's nothing more than disguised vulgarity, a desperate attempt to fill an inner void that no amount of decibels can ever satisfy. In the streets of our cities, we can observe this phenomenon in all its variations. The driver who unnecessarily revs his car engine while waiting at a traffic light. The pedestrian who speaks on the phone at a volume that allows the entire block to learn about his personal affairs. The restaurant that confuses ambiance with auditory aggression, where background music transforms into a sound wall that makes meaningful conversation impossible. But noise isn't only acoustic, it's also visual, emotional, intellectual. It's any excessive stimulus that distracts us from the essential, fragments our attention, interrupts our flow of thought. It's the person who can't maintain a conversation without constantly checking their phone. It's the excess of unsolicited opinions. It's the need to dominate every social space with the brute force of personality. Dostoevsky masterfully captured this vulgarity in characters like Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, the dissolute father whose noisy presence, in every possible sense, reflects a profound spiritual emptiness. Or in figures like Pyotr Stepanovich from Demons, an incessant manipulator whose constant chatter serves to hide the absence of authentic convictions. The Russian writer understood that noise is often proportional to inner emptiness, that those who shout the loudest are frequently those who carry the least peace within. It's no coincidence that the wisest and most centered characters in his work, Prince Mishkin, Alyosha Karamazov, Elder Zosima, are also the quietest, the most measured in their expression. This psychological observation of Dostoevsky finds an echo in our daily reality. Think about any social or professional gathering you've recently attended. Who dominated the conversation? Were they really those with the most valuable ideas, or simply those with greater lung capacity and less social inhibition? The tragedy of our time is that we've begun to confuse volume with authority, frequency with relevance, stridency with conviction. Social networks have exacerbated this confusion, rewarding the immediate over the reflective, the provocative over the nuanced, the simplistic over the complex. And so, we find ourselves in a communicative landscape where shouting louder equals being right, where publishing more content, regardless of its quality, equals being influential. Noise, as is known, is valued all the more when one has less to say. This observation takes on disturbing dimensions in an era where noise has been industrialized, commercialized, and elevated to the status of virtue. The acoustic pollution of our American cities isn't simply an environmental problem. It's a symptom of a collective spiritual disease. Scientific studies confirm the devastating effects of constant noise on our physical and mental health: chronic stress, cognitive deterioration, sleep disorders, elevated anxiety. But beyond these measurable impacts, there exists a more subtle and perhaps more pernicious dimension. Noise disconnects us from ourselves. In the constant sonic bombardment, we lose the ability to hear our inner voice, that whisper of intuition and wisdom that can only be perceived in stillness. We also lose the ability to listen deeply to others, to perceive the emotional nuances expressed in pauses, in silences, in what remains unsaid. The vulgarity of noise manifests in increasingly sophisticated forms. It's not just about the neighbor who organizes strident parties until dawn, though this too is a form of acoustic aggression. It's about an entire culture that has declared war on silence. We enter a cafe and are greeted by ambient music at excessive volume. We get into a rideshare and the driver assumes we want to hear his preferred radio station. We visit a department store and each section competes with the others in musical volume, creating zones of sonic interference where multiple melodies collide in cacophony. Even our electronic devices, those inseparable companions of modern life, come pre-configured to constantly interrupt us with alerts and notifications. Constant overstimulation leads us to a neuronal exhaustion that makes deep thinking, genuine creativity, and the contemplation necessary for a rich inner life impossible. And without inner life, what remains? Only noise, superficial entertainment, perpetual distraction. Elegance, by contrast, resides precisely in the capacity to resist this tendency. The elegant person, in the deepest sense of the term, isn't one who wears expensive clothes or frequents exclusive places, but one who maintains inner composure in a world that constantly tries to decompose it. The vulgarity of constant noise also manifests in the inability to tolerate silence in conversation. Those moments of pause that, far from being uncomfortable voids that must be immediately filled, are spaces where the most meaningful communication occurs. Silence allows what's just been said to resonate, for emotions to be processed, for ideas to settle. The most tragic consequence of this loss is the extreme polarization we observe in public discourse. Without space for nuance, for creative doubt, for genuine listening to others, we divide into enemy camps that shout at each other without ever understanding. Noise not only hinders individual thought, it destroys the very possibility of meaningful social dialogue. Noise, moreover, has become a deliberate strategy of distraction. Economic and political powers have understood that a people constantly bombarded by stimuli, constantly reacting to the latest controversy, constantly exhausted by processing superfluous information, is a people incapable of the sustained reflection necessary to question power structures or imagine alternatives to the status quo. Vulgarity is not, then, merely a question of aesthetics or good manners. It's a form of social control, a renunciation of our most human capacity: deep thought. What about work environments? Open office spaces, so in vogue in the contemporary corporate world, perhaps represent the clearest expression of our erroneous valuation of noise over silence. Supposedly designed to foster collaboration, these environments sacrifice deep concentration on the altar of a communication that is frequently nothing more than continuous distraction. Creative productivity dramatically decreases in noisy environments. Tasks requiring complex thinking, problem-solving, or genuine innovation need periods of uninterrupted concentration that only silence can provide. Truly visionary companies have begun implementing silence zones and quiet hours, where interruptions are prohibited, devices silenced, and concentration protected as the precious resource it is. These practices aren't eccentric luxuries, but pragmatic recognitions of how the human brain actually works. The inelegance of noisy people manifests not only in their public behavior, but also in the quality of their work and relationships. Constant noise, whether acoustic or behavioral, reflects and generates superficial, fragmented, reactive thinking. A thinking incapable of perceiving complex patterns, anticipating long-term consequences, integrating seemingly contradictory perspectives into creative syntheses. Genuine creativity, not simply content production, but the generation of truly original ideas, requires that mental space only silence can provide. It requires the capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to inhabit questions without rushing toward premature answers, to allow unexpected connections to emerge naturally instead of forcing them. In our current culture, where external validation has become a collective addiction, silence represents an act of courageous self-determination. It's the affirmation that my value doesn't depend on being constantly seen and heard. It's the understanding that true confidence doesn't need to announce itself loudly. Thus, while the noisy person desperately seeks to fill every silence for fear of irrelevance, the internally elegant person cultivates the ability to comfortably inhabit silence, knowing that it's precisely in these apparently empty spaces where the most valuable things we have to offer the world emerge. Noise in all its manifestations isn't presence but disguised absence. Absence of inner peace, absence of authentic confidence, absence of that fundamental security that allows us to be without constantly needing to prove it. And you, what do you choose? The strident vulgarity of constant noise, or the refined elegance of conscious silence? Silence is a choice of leadership and authenticity. True authority doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. Its power doesn't lie in the volume of its voice, but in the depth of its vision, in the clarity of its purpose, in the coherence between its words and actions. This is the essence of silent leadership, a form of influence that doesn't impose itself but attracts, that doesn't demand attention, but naturally receives it. Dostoevsky, again, captured this paradox in his literature. The noisiest characters, like Fyodor Karamazov or Pyotr Verkovensky, exercise a type of superficial and ephemeral influence, while the silent ones, like Alyosha or Prince Mishkin, profoundly transform the lives they touch. This literary contrast reflects a deep psychological truth. We easily confuse domination with leadership, protagonism with real influence. The noisy person may momentarily dominate a social space through the brute force of personality, but rarely inspires the kind of lasting respect that leads to genuine change. In today's American companies and organizations, we can clearly observe this difference. The boss who micromanages through constant instructions, endless meetings, and excessive communication generates a type of superficial compliance, frequently accompanied by underlying resentment. In contrast, the leader who speaks with precision, listens attentively, and respects the autonomy of their team cultivates an environment where creativity and commitment naturally flourish. When we stop filling space with our words, we create the possibility for deeper connection and genuine mutual understanding. This phenomenon explains why the best negotiators, therapists, and mediators are masters of strategic silence. They know when to be quiet, when to let silence do the work that no words could accomplish. It also explains why the most effective leaders speak less than they listen. It's not simply a technique of effective communication, it's a complete philosophy about power and influence. Silence, when consciously exercised, shifts the focus from the leader's ego to the needs, capabilities, and perspectives of those around them. But silence as a leadership choice goes beyond simply speaking less and listening more. It's also about cultivating the capacity for reflective pause, for that moment of mental stillness where we evaluate multiple perspectives before deciding. The noisy leader reacts immediately, driven by first impressions, unexamined biases, the pressure to appear decisive. The silent leader, however, allows that crucial moment of reflection, where intuition and analysis work together to produce wiser, more nuanced, more effective long-term decisions. This reflective pause, this inner silence amid the pressure to act immediately, is perhaps the most difficult and valuable aspect of silent leadership. In a business and political world that rewards quick action and immediate results, taking time to reflect may seem an unaffordable luxury. But truly, visionary leaders understand that this apparent luxury is actually a strategic necessity. Conscious silence is also the foundation of authenticity, that increasingly valued and increasingly scarce trait in our leaders. To be authentic, one must first know oneself. And this self-knowledge only emerges in silence, in those moments where we stop projecting an image outward and allow ourselves to simply be. Dostoevsky profoundly understood this connection between silence and authenticity. His most authentic characters are precisely those who have gone through periods of transformative silence, of painful but necessary introspection. It's in that encounter with themselves, far from the noise of social expectations and imposed masks, where they discover their true essence and, with it, the capacity for a meaningful life. Similarly, the most inspiring leaders of our time are those who maintain that connection with their inner voice, who don't allow external noise, others' expectations, passing trends, conformist pressure, to drown out their deepest convictions. To cultivate this type of silent leadership in our daily lives, we don't need positions of formal authority. Each of us exerts influence in our social, family, and professional circles. And this influence can be profoundly transformed when we embrace the power of conscious silence. Begin by practicing genuine listening. Not that superficial form of listening where we simply wait our turn to speak, but that total presence where we really absorb what the other is communicating, both with their words and with their silences, their gestures, their tones of voice. Continue cultivating the habit of reflective pause. Before responding to a provocative email, before making a decision under pressure, before reacting to criticism, take a moment of silence to connect with your center, your values, your broader purpose. Practice verbal economy. Say more with less. Eliminate unnecessary fillers, redundancies, excessive explanations from your communication. Trust in the power of the precise word, chosen carefully and pronounced with intention. Consciously create spaces of silence in your day. Moments where you step away from screens and conversations to simply be with yourself. These aren't unproductive moments. They're essential investments in your mental clarity and emotional centering. And finally, learn to value silence in groups. To create those moments in meetings and conversations where everyone can breathe, process, reflect. Where silence isn't an uncomfortable void that must be immediately filled, but a fertile field where new ideas and deeper understandings can germinate. Silent leadership isn't passivity or timidity. Quite the opposite. It requires far greater inner strength and self-assurance than noisy leadership. Anyone can momentarily impose themselves through volume and aggressiveness. Creating lasting influence from conscious silence is the real challenge, and the true mark of personal mastery. In a deep sense, silence is also a political act in a world where noise is systematically used to manipulate, distract, divide. When we refuse to participate in the cacophony of polarized debate, when we choose precise words instead of empty slogans, when we create spaces for reflection instead of reaction, we are actively resisting the forces that benefit from constant noise. This political dimension of silence was deeply understood by Dostoevsky. In novels like Demons, he shows how verbal chaos, deliberate confusion, informational saturation can be used as tools of social control. And he also shows how conscious silence can become a refuge for independent thought, for that inner freedom that no totalitarian regime can completely take away. Contemporary society faces its own forms of pollution, not just acoustic, but informational. The oversaturation of contradictory messages, the extreme polarization of public discourse, the immediacy that makes measured reflection impossible. In this context, cultivating internal silence becomes not only a practice of personal well-being, but an act of civic resistance. And you? Will you continue shouting to be heard? Or will you allow silence to reveal who you really are? If this reflection has touched you, like the video, share in the comments what silence represents for you, and subscribe to the channel for more content that elevates your consciousness.